Welcome back. So this is going to be the first of several lectures focusing on the linguistic history of Old English. So we'll start with some graphemes and lexicon, and we'll see that in this lecture that there's a rich vocabulary, there's extensive resources for forming new words. We got a little bit of a taste of that in the social and political history lecture, and that loanwords are actually a relatively insignificant part of the lexicon during the Old English time period. The next several lectures cover syntax, phonology, and morphology. So in syntax, we see that the word order in Old English somewhat resembles present-day English, but is freer and more varied. We'll see some examples of some of that variation. In phonology, there's some notable differences from present-day English to Old English. So Old English featured some long consonants and long vowels. There were some sounds that we didn't have in Old English that we now have in present-day English, such as our velar nasal and voiced fricatives, and there was a more predictable stress pattern in Old English than what we see in present-day English. And then finally, in morphology, we'll see a lot of heavy inflection in Old English that we no longer see in present-day English. There were 4 cases. We had 3 genders. There were numbers, tenses, persons, moods. There were verb and adjective classes, so there's a lot going on in morphology during the Old English period. So those lectures will focus on those separate topics individually. This lecture will focus just on the graphemes writing system and some of the lexicon issues. And we can start by just looking at some of the influences that we see in the British Isles during this time period. So you'll notice that in the early part of Old English, that Old English is found mostly just on the eastern coast and in the southern part of England, where the invasions first took place. And then by the end of the Old English period, you can see that Old English has taken over a much larger area of England and has sort of moved the Celtic languages to the edges of the English Isle, so Old Welsh, Old Cornish, just in those far western regions, whereas Irish had sort of taken over not only the island of Ireland, but also into the Scottish area as well. When we think about the graphemes and the writing systems that we saw in Old English, you'll notice that the Old Norse-speaking people and other Germanic peoples had their own mode of writing, and they were using what is known as the Runic alphabet. So runes are hundreds of years old by this time period, by the time we get into writing in the Old English period. Some of the earliest surviving inscriptions date all the way back to the 2nd century. And Latin literacy is what eventually pushed out this runic writing. Even though it remained around long after the conversion to Christianity, we see a lot of Viking Age runestones having Christian inscriptions and talking about issues related to the Christianization of this area. But the runes themselves are found less frequently in English in the British Isles than they are in mainland areas where runes were used. There's about 5,000 or 6,000 runic inscriptions that we found in Scandinavia. Over 3,000 of those are in modern-day Sweden, but we have found some in northern Germany, in Russia, in Greenland, in Scotland, Isle of Man, England, Ireland. So the British Isles did have some that we found, although the vast majority of them are what we find in Scandinavia. There's actually not very much known about the origins of the runic alphabet. We traditionally refer to this as Futhark. This is named after the first 6 letters of it. Rune initially means letter, text, or inscription in Old Norse, but meant something closer to mystery or secret in other Old Germanic languages. And this is partly due to the fact that runes did play an important role in ritual and magic during this time, and even continuing into the present day. There's a few theories as to where runes come from. None of them are things that we know for sure. That the alphabet was probably created independently rather than evolving from another alphabet. There's not really evidence of it coming directly from any other alphabet. It was probably first used in southern Europe and carried north by these Germanic tribes. And it's thought to have been modeled somewhat on Latin or the Etruscan alphabet when it was first created, although it wasn't necessarily just adapting those alphabets, but may have had some influence from them. Most of the known inscriptions that we have today from the runic alphabet are from the 11th century, so from the very end of the Old English time period. There were some extra letters that were added to the runic alphabet in order to write Anglo-Saxon and Old English, largely because some of the sounds that are found in Old English were different than what some of the characters represented initially. Runes were most likely brought to Britain in the 5th century by the Anglo-Saxon tribes when they first invaded, and we find them mostly on things like jewelry, weapons, stones, things like that. But very few runic manuscripts have survived, and those are from a later period of time. To take a look at what the runic alphabet would have looked like, this gives you an idea of the older form of Futhark. And so this is named after those first 6 letters. So the first one representing an F sound, the second one representing an U sound, the thorn representing a th sound or the sound, the next one representing more of an O or an ah sound, the R sound, and then the K sound that you see with the symbol that's labeled torch. You may have noticed in class that I wear the torch rune around my neck. So that is little strange connection there. But this gives you some of the examples of what these different runes would have looked like during this time period. However, over time, some of the changes to this alphabet did take place, and so we see younger Futhark, or sometimes called normal runes, having evolved over many years, stabilizing around 800. This was the main alphabet used in Scandinavia, so throughout areas of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, throughout the Viking Age. This was also largely replaced by the Latin alphabet even there by around 1200. So by the earlier periods of Middle English, even the Scandinavian areas had sort of lost use of the runic alphabet and sort of adopted the Latin alphabet. And there were some slightly different versions developed in each of these regions. So if we look at this, you'll notice that some of the symbols look somewhat similar to the older version, but some of them are quite different as well. So the K sound, the torch that you see, rather than pointing down, it has instead something pointing up. There's some sort of simplified shapes that you see in these ones that we don't see in the elder version of this. But you can notice that while some of them are very similar to each other, others have a little bit more variation from one region to another. So we do see some differences already forming in the use of this alphabet over time. To give an example of how this would have looked in an Old English text, so you can see Old English on the top row, you see the middle line being the runic transcription, and this sentence says, "And how shall I do that?" asked the king. And you can see some of the similarities between the Old English and English. There's still some things that we can see as overlap between some of those words that look somewhat similar, but you can see how vastly different the runic alphabet would have looked for writing the same kinds of things. We actually have very little documentation, however, of Old English in any of the runic alphabets. During most of the Old English time period, most of the speakers were non-literate, so what little writing was done was usually not standardized and was going to depend on which monastery you were at, which region of England you were at, which kingdom you may have been a part of. And most evidence of the runic transcriptions and names that exist are written in the Latin alphabet. So the discussions of runic transcription is often written in Latin script, even when they're talking about runes. There is evidence that Anglo-Saxons used both runes and the Roman script, and that runes were primarily used very early on, and really only in carvings. We don't really have any books or standard writings found during this time period that were written in runes in English and in the British Isles. The Latin script was used to spread Christianity through the region, and by the early periods of Old English, Christianity had already spread into the British Isles. Some of the symbols were modified a little bit from their original to adapt to how English was spoken. So the th sound, for instance, thorn, remained in Old English script for sounds that we now use a th for. So we'll see examples of Old English Latin script that still sort of used a few of these symbols from runic alphabets that give us some idea of some of the influence that it would have had even on the Roman or Latin script that was primarily used. In terms of lexicon, the Old English vocabulary probably had about 50,000 to 60,000 words, and very few of these were borrowings. These were mostly native vocabulary terms. Not a lot of this was borrowed from elsewhere. The earliest versions did rely very heavily on native vocabulary, and we can see that there's some flexibility, there's some metaphoric quality in the vocabulary, and you can especially see this in the Beowulf writings, where there's 36 synonyms for words like here or prince, there's 30 synonyms for the word for sea. So some of the very common words that they were using, they had a lot of different words for that and a lot of different synonyms for that. So there was still some flexibility within their native vocabulary, but not a lot of borrowings of these terms. And most of the strategy for existing vocabulary and adding words was through a process of compounding. And this is something that's relatively common in a lot of Germanic languages, and we see this pretty widely used in a lot of Old English words as well. There was some influence of other languages, but not as much as you might have expected. So Celtic had a little bit of influence, but not very much, mostly because the Celts were a conquered people and they were sort of moved out of the area rather than staying to have an overlap in language contact. Latin, however, though there was some influence, never really became the mother tongue in England and was really only found amongst people who were literate, amongst people who were religious. So you would have seen Latin being used mostly just for writing and mostly just in things like monasteries. But because there were centuries of influence of Latin, things like military, economic, social interaction words did enter into our vocabulary, and they did tend to center around those kinds of semantic fields. So in military, we get camp from battle, pil, which meant javelin, mil, which meant mile. In trade and commerce, we get words like chiep, which is cheap, kund or pound, chin for wine. So some of them we see even today as sort of evolutions of these borrowings. Some household words like cup, dish, cheese, spelt, which is wheat, were also found as Latin influences during this time, but not a lot as compared to what you might expect. And we did lose some Old English vocabulary over time. It's suggested that about 65 to 85% of Old English words have been lost since the Old English period. However, of the most frequently used words that you find in Old English poetry, about 80 of those have survived. And of the 100 most written words in present-day English, 96 of these come from Old English, and the remaining ones come from Old Norse. So we can see the influence of those Scandinavian varieties, even in our most common words. So words like are, they, them, and their are coming from Old Norse. All the rest of our most common words are English, Old English in origin. So we can see that in our very common words, we have a very close tie to our Germanic roots even today. And generally, these remaining native words are found in most commonly used concepts, which is what you would expect in a lot of languages, regardless of which language it is, regardless of language contact. You would expect that the most commonly used terms would remain native and would preserve themselves over time. So these semantic fields, things like kinship, flora and fauna, natural phenomenon, function words, things that you might find in the Swadesh list are going to be the ones that we still see retaining that historic Germanic roots. So things like man, wife, child, brother, God, eat, drink, our function words like our pronoun system, conjunctions, some auxiliaries and prepositions, which there were fewer of in Old English, but the ones that we had there, we still see today largely. And if we want to sort of just quickly wrap up thinking about the lexicon, thinking about this loss of Old English vocabulary over time, we can also think about some reasons why this happens. And these are common to other language situations as well, where some words just sort of wear out. There may be sound changes that reduce them to where there's little left of the original word. You can lose words when sound changes make two previously distinct words identical, so then you come up with a sort of new word to replace one of them. They can be lost just due to different sort of cultural or technological changes. So our social and legal systems today are vastly different than what they were during Old English times. So we don't really need a specific word for the compensation for a man's life, or we don't need a specific word for to stone to death, because we don't really have those situations happening in our everyday culture today the way that they would have been during those periods of times. You also see that technology will often change eliminated words or replace them with new words as different technological changes take place. So as we move into other areas of English, we see how technology has an influence in what vocabulary stays and what vocabulary goes away. We see a lot of taboo words frequently replaced with euphemisms, and so this continues to happen over time cyclically. And this happens across languages as well. This isn't unique to Old English by any means. We can also see that semantic changes in one area can set up a chain of reactions that end up getting rid of some of those other words. So as one semantic field changes and there are different words that are used, this can have an effect on some of the other areas as well. And then what we often see in Old English, as well as in other languages around the world historically, is that words will fall victim to what's fashionable, what's determined to be useful. So there's a higher prestige generally for urban forms over rural forms, so those tend to take over for upper upper class, more prestigious forms versus lower class forms, those tend to take over. And this is what led to a very large change in our vocabulary after the Norman conquest, because French was the prestige language. It was that language that had power and was used among the upper classes. So this is where a lot of lexicon can come from in those language contact situations. And so because of the influence of French in the beginning of the Middle English period, we also see a lot of our Old English vocabulary fall by the wayside in lieu of using French forms instead. So that gives us a brief overview of things like the writing system and some of the lexicon. In the next lectures, we'll look more at some of the other structures of language in the Old English period and some of the major changes that took place. As always, email me, schedule office hours, bring questions to class, and we'll talk through them together and do some practice on things like vocabulary.